been meditating on this gospel all week as I sat before the Blessed Sacrament and thoughts came into my mind. I jotted things down. Sometimes that's how homilies work. So a bunch of random thoughts hopefully come together as a homily. The scene of our gospel opens today with Jesus leaving the Galilean mountains. He's just delivered his sermon on the Beatitudes, so he's about to take off his academic gown and hood and replace it with the mantle of the miracle worker. Now, even though Mark's gospel is the shortest of the four, it contains the most miracles. Christ was being followed by a huge mob of people. And as he approached a nearby town, a desperate man breaks through the mob and painfully gets on his knees before Jesus. The crowd runs away in horror, for the fellow is an unnamed leper. Leprosy was a common disease in the ancient world of Jesus. In its late stages, the illness was quite a terrible scene. Substitute foul-smelling sores for a nose, lips, ears, toes. And you get the picture. The Jews of Jesus' day did not look upon leprosy so much as a physical disease, but rather the effects of a sinful person being punished by God. So a leper was carrying not only a horrible physical wound within himself, he also carried the conviction that God hated him. Jewish law was very harsh to lepers. We got a glimpse of that in our first reading. They were to live outside of towns. If they were to encounter at a distance a clean person, they were to ring a bell and they were to shout, "Unclean, unclean." The ancient historian Josephus records that they were in effect dead men. So imagine for a moment the courage of this fellow. The law also stated that if that leper exposed others to his disease, he was to be stoned to death. Lucky for him that the mob, when they saw him, ran. Otherwise, they might have stoned him to death. So the question now rises, how did this leper know? How did this leper sense that Jesus would not also flee in revulsion with everybody else? What quality did he discern in Jesus that told him that Jesus would hold his ground? St. Mark in this gospel is telling us an awful lot about Jesus, even in this simple little story. He is signaling to us that Jesus is first and foremost approachable. We discover that Jesus has time for those who others considered human garbage. Sometimes we hear people say, "My sin is so horrible that not even God can forgive it." This gospel today tells us that that is so untrue. And the mystics tell us that God will forgive us, not because of who we are, but because that's who God is. forgiving, merciful. If you want to, you can cure me. 8 succinct words. The leper's gut plea, couched in those 8 words. If you want to, you can cure me. People who are in an awful amount of pain don't speak in pages. They only have time for the essentials. This gospel account also tells us that Jesus cured him by touching his running sores. Imagine touching those open wounds. Can any of us here today imagine what that must have felt like to that leper? Probably this was the first time in years that he had physical touch, physical contact with another human being. Someone had actually placed his clean hands upon him. And I suppose if one picture is worth 1,000 words, one touch, in this case, must be worth 10,000 to that leper. Is there anyone here anymore that can be frightened by Jesus Christ? The miracle that Jesus works here in Mark's gospel is called by our biblical scholars an action miracle. It happens in a nanosecond, unlike the other miracles in Mark. Just the other day in one of our weekday masses, Jesus encountered a man born deaf and was mute. He couldn't speak, and there's a whole process in that healing. It's like Jesus is kind of reading the instruction manual. Jesus takes the man aside, and then Jesus looks up to the heavens, and then Jesus emits a loud groan. And then Jesus spits and takes that spittle and puts it in his ear and on his tongue. But Jesus doesn't do any of that here. Jesus of Nazareth felt there was no time for these preliminaries. This fellow's misery had to be terminated immediately. So what does that also tell us about this Jesus whom we worship? Would that we could teach ourselves to have just a fraction of the compassion that Jesus shows. And even though we might not have a healing ministry, each of us really should practice a hearing ministry, because suffering people need to talk. Walt Whitman wrote, "Seeing a wounded soldier on the battlefield, I do not ask who he is. I become the wounded man." So it should be with us. And G.K. Chesterton writes, "One who is Christ-centered instead of self-centered is a sane person in an insane world." And one last thought in these random thoughts of mine. You know, that cured man in the gospel today also teaches us how to pray. 8 simple words. If you want to, you can cure me. Not that there's anything wrong with longer and lengthier prayers, but Jesus tends to show a fondness sometimes for these briefer prayers. In other words, Jesus is emailing us information that brief prayers oftentimes produce quick answers. God bless you.